My son said those words on a Sunday evening. Not privately. Not during some difficult conversation between two people who loved each other and were trying to work through a problem. He said them at the dinner table, in front of his wife, in front of my grandchildren, and in front of me. "Dad," Brandon said, placing his fork beside his plate, "you need to stop wasting my money." The table went completely silent. My daughter-in-law, Pamela, suddenly became very interested in her plate. My 7-year-old granddaughter continued eating her mashed potatoes, blissfully unaware of the tension filling the room. But my grandson, 10 years old, and already far too good at reading people's faces, stopped eating. He looked at his father, then at me. I was 66 years old, and I was sitting at the head of a table I had paid for, in a house I had paid for, eating food I had paid for, and listening to the son whose college education, wedding, house, and business opportunities I had spent 34 years supporting. Brandon Keith Mercer looked at me as though he had just delivered a reasonable financial observation. I looked at him, and I said nothing. That was the first decision I made that night. I didn't argue. I didn't remind him how much I had given him. I didn't embarrass him in front of his children. I simply picked up my fork and finished my dinner. Then I said goodnight to my grandchildren. I hugged them both, and I drove home. The entire drive, one sentence kept repeating in my mind. Stop wasting my money. By the time I reached my house, I understood something. Brandon wasn't angry because he thought I was wasting money. He was angry because somewhere along the way, he had started believing that my money was his, and I had allowed that misunderstanding to happen. I didn't sleep much that night. At 4 a.m, I stopped trying. I went into the kitchen and made coffee. Then I sat at the same table where my wife, Vivian, had kept her accounting files for almost 30 years. Vivian had been gone since 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Before she died, she had given me one warning about our son. At the time, I hadn't wanted to hear it. That morning, I finally understood it. Be careful with Brandon. She had said those words quietly. I had answered, "He's our son." She had looked at me and said, "I know. I'm asking you to know that too." I closed my eyes. Then I reached for my phone. At 7:15 Monday morning, I called Leonard Park. Leonard had been my attorney for more than a decade. He answered on the second ring. "Harold?" "Leonard," I said, "I need your help." There was a pause. "What happened?" I told him about Sunday dinner. I told him exactly what Brandon had said. Then I told him about the business expense account. There had been warning signs for months. I had simply refused to act on them. Leonard listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me one question. "What outcome do you want?" I stared through the kitchen window. For the first time since Vivian died, I knew exactly what I wanted. "Clarity," I said, "for both of us." Leonard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Then let's create it." What Brandon didn't know was that by 9:15 that morning, his access to the company accounts would be gone, and by Wednesday, he would be sitting across from me with a document that would force him to confront a number he had never bothered to calculate, $314,000. But before I tell you what happened in that conference room, you need to understand how we got there. Because Brandon hadn't always been this entitled, and I hadn't always been this willing to let him have whatever he wanted. I had spent 34 years building my son. The problem was that somewhere along the way, I had forgotten to teach him the difference between being loved and being owed. My name is Harold James Mercer. I'm 66 years old. And this is the story of the Sunday my son told me to stop wasting his money. And the Monday morning, I finally showed him whose money it had been all along. Before I tell you what happened on Monday, you need to understand what came before it. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. My father, Keith Leonard Mercer, drove a delivery truck for 28 years. My mother, Dorothy, worked part-time at a pharmacy and spent the rest of her time making sure her children never questioned whether they were loved. We didn't have much. But I learned something from my father that stayed with me for the rest of my life. If you wanted something, you worked for it. And if you gave someone your word, you kept it. In 1989, I took $12,000 I had saved from working in the construction industry and started a small supply company in Atlanta. 3 employees, 1 used truck, 1 warehouse, and a customer list built almost entirely on relationships. The company was called Mercer Supply and Materials. It wasn't impressive, but it was mine. By 2005, we had 42 employees. By 2015, we had 3 warehouse locations and more than 100 employees. And through all those years, my wife Vivian was the person behind the numbers. She was an accountant by training, but she had a way of looking at money that I never possessed. I looked at what money could build. Vivian looked at where it was going. She could find a problem in a spreadsheet the way some people find a stain on a white shirt. Nothing escaped her. Then in 2019, cancer took her. 11 weeks. That's all we had from diagnosis to goodbye. After she died, I kept working because I didn't know what else to do. The company continued. The employees continued. The bills continued. Life, as it always does, continued. But Brandon changed. He was 34 years old now, and I had spent most of his life making sure he never had to worry about money. His education was paid for. Georgia Tech. Tuition, room, board, books, and a monthly allowance. All of it came from me. When he married Pamela in 2018, I paid for the wedding, $42,000. Pamela's family didn't have much, and Brandon told me that giving them a beautiful wedding would mean everything to him. So I said yes. A year later, Brandon wanted to buy a house in Marietta. The house was more expensive than he could comfortably afford. He was short $120,000 on the down payment. He came to me. At the time, Vivian was dying. Her diagnosis was only 3 weeks old. I wasn't thinking like a businessman. I was thinking like a father who had just realized how little time he might have left with his wife. So I gave Brandon the money. I didn't loan it to him. I gave it to him. That distinction would become very important later. In 2018, I had also brought Brandon into Mercer Supply and Materials. He had a business degree and a natural ability to talk to people. So I gave him a position in sales. His salary was $94,000 a year. He had a company expense account for legitimate business expenses. It had a monthly limit. There were rules. At least, I thought there were. Brandon began treating that account differently. At first, the charges were small. A restaurant dinner here, a personal purchase there. Nothing that looked serious enough to justify a confrontation with my son. Then Susan Reeves called me. Susan had been Vivian's protege. After Vivian died, she became one of the people I trusted most with the company's finances. She had noticed something. "Harold," she said one afternoon, "I think you should look at Brandon's expense account." I already knew what she was going to say. Still, I asked, "What did you find?" 12 months of statements, she said. $22,000 in expenses that don't appear to be business-related. 22,000. I sat quietly at my desk. Restaurants, personal travel, retail purchases, expenses that had no obvious connection to construction supplies or company business. I could have confronted Brandon that afternoon. I didn't. That was my mistake. Because the expense account wasn't the only warning sign. For years, Brandon had started calling Mercer Supply and Materials our company. At first, I didn't mind. It was a family business. He was my son. But eventually, the words changed. He started making decisions as though he owned it. He gave opinions about employees. He pushed for contracts. He questioned pricing. He talked about expansion. And he did it with the confidence of an heir, not an employee. Susan noticed it too. One day, she said something that stayed with me. "Harold, I think Brandon has built a future for himself in his head." "What do you mean?" "He thinks he's going to inherit the company." I looked at her. "I never told him that." Susan nodded. "I know." That was the problem. I had never promised Brandon the company, but I had also never clearly told him that it wasn't his. I had allowed silence to become an assumption, and assumptions, when money is involved, can become dangerous. Still, I kept delaying the conversation, until Sunday night. Until Brandon looked at me across that dinner table and said, "Dad, you need to stop wasting my money." That sentence didn't create the problem. It simply made it impossible for me to ignore anymore. So on Monday morning, I made 3 calls. The first was to Leonard, the second was to Susan, and the third was to George Patterson. George had worked for Mercer Supply and Materials since 2001. He knew every warehouse, every major client, every operational weakness, every employee who could be trusted when things got difficult. He also knew Vivian. When I called him at 8:20 that morning, he answered immediately. "Harold?" "George, I need to make some changes." There was a short silence. Then he said, "I've been waiting for this call." I leaned back in my chair. "You knew?" "I've watched Brandon for years," George said. "I just didn't think it was my place to tell you how to handle your son." He was right. It wasn't his place. It was mine. And by that morning, I had finally decided to handle it. Not by taking Brandon's money, not by humiliating him, not by destroying his career. I was going to take away something far more important. the illusion that what belonged to the company belonged to him. At 9:15 that morning, Susan made the first change. Brandon's corporate card was deactivated. Then his access to the procurement system was suspended. Then his limited signatory authority on the company's secondary operating account was revoked. 3 changes. Less than 10 minutes. And Brandon didn't know any of it was happening, yet. Because the next person to discover what had happened would be Brandon himself. And when he did, he was going to call me. But he wasn't going to get the answer he expected. By 9:30 Monday morning, everything had changed. Brandon still didn't know it. He was probably sitting at his desk, making calls, answering emails, and assuming that the company was operating exactly as it had the Friday before. But the company was no longer operating on assumptions. Neither was I. Susan had removed Brandon's access to the corporate expense account. His company card was inactive. His procurement access was suspended, and his limited authority over the secondary operating account was gone. None of this touched his personal bank account. None of it touched his salary. None of it took away money that belonged to him. I wanted that distinction to be absolutely clear. I wasn't taking from my son. I was separating my son's money from the company's money. And there was another thing I wanted: documentation. At 10 o'clock that morning, Leonard began preparing a complete financial record. Every transfer, every payment, every major expense I had covered for Brandon during the previous 6 years. I wanted everything in one place. No accusations, no emotional arguments, just numbers. By Monday afternoon, Susan had finished compiling the records. She walked into my office carrying a thick folder. She placed it on my desk. "Harold," she said, "you should probably sit down." I smiled. "I've been sitting down all morning." She opened the folder. "The total is $314,000. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I'd known I had given Brandon a lot, but knowing something emotionally and seeing it written in black and white are two different experiences. $314,000. His college education, his wedding, his house down payment, his salary, and $22,000 in personal expenses charged to a business account. I looked at the number for a long time. Then I closed the folder. "Print it." Susan looked at me. "All of it?" "All of it." "Do you want to send it to Brandon?" "Not yet." I put the folder in the same drawer where Vivian had kept her accounting records. "I'll give it to him myself." Susan nodded. Then she left. I sat alone in the office. $314,000. That number wasn't what hurt. What hurt was realizing that my son had somehow looked at everything I had given him and concluded that I was wasting his money. I thought about Vivian. She had warned me. Not because she wanted me to love Brandon less, because she wanted me to understand that love without boundaries can create entitlement. And I had confused the two. I had thought saying yes was the same thing as being a good father. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes saying no is the harder form of love. I didn't have to wait long for Brandon to discover what had happened. Tuesday morning at 9:45, my phone rang. "Dad?" "Good morning, Brandon." "My card isn't working." I said nothing. "I tried calling Susan. She won't tell me what's going on." "I know." "My procurement access is gone." "I know." There was a pause. Then his voice changed. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything to your personal finances." "Then why can't I access the company systems?" "Because those systems belong to the company." He became quiet. "Dad, what is this?" "Come to the office tomorrow morning." "Why?" "Because we're going to have a conversation." "About what?" I looked across the room at Vivian's old chair. Clarity. He didn't like that answer. I could hear it in his breathing. "Dad, just tell me what's happening." "Tomorrow, 9 o'clock. He hesitated. Then he said, "Fine." I ended the call. That afternoon, Pamela called me. Her voice was completely different from Brandon's. She wasn't angry. She sounded scared. "Harold," she said, "are we in trouble?" I leaned back in my chair. "Pamela, are the children okay?" "Yes." "Then the most important things are fine." She was quiet. "Do you want me at the meeting tomorrow?" "Yes." Another pause. "Okay." I knew then that something was happening inside that family that I hadn't fully understood, and I was about to find out what it was. Wednesday morning, Brandon arrived at 8:52, 8 minutes early. He walked into the conference room wearing a dark jacket and an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not confidence, uncertainty. Pamela came with him. Leonard was already seated to my right. Susan sat to my left. In front of her was the folder. The folder containing the number Brandon had never bothered to calculate. $14,000. Brandon sat down. Nobody spoke. Finally, I looked at him. Brandon, before we begin, I want you to understand something. He watched me carefully. I love you. His jaw tightened. That hasn't changed. He looked down. But what happened Sunday cannot happen again. He knew exactly what I meant. You told me I was wasting your money. He didn't answer. You said it at the dinner table, in front of Pamela, in front of your children. He swallowed. I continued. I want to explain something about that money. I nodded towards Susan. She pushed the folder across the table. Brandon looked at it, then at me. What is this? Open it. He did. He turned the first page, then the second, then the third. His eyes moved slowly down the page. He stopped. I watched his face. He wasn't angry anymore. He was calculating. Finally, he looked up. Dad? I said nothing. What is this? Everything I've given you over the last 6 years. He looked back at the pages. I said, $314,000. The room went silent. Brandon stared at the number. Then Pamela leaned slightly forward. She began reading the pages too. College, wedding, house, salary, expenses, everything. Brandon looked at me. But... His voice was barely audible. I waited. Then he said, That's not... He stopped. I knew what he was going to say. I leaned forward. Not what? He looked at the document again. I said quietly, That money wasn't wasted, Brandon. His eyes lifted to mine. It was given. I paused. There's a difference. Nobody moved. Then I pointed to the expense report. The company account is different. That $22,000 wasn't yours either. Brandon's face changed, and for the first time since Sunday, I saw something that looked less like anger and more like fear, because he finally understood. This meeting wasn't about me taking something away from him. It was about me showing him what he had already been given. And the next question was the one I had been avoiding for years. I looked directly at my son. Brandon, I said, what exactly did you think you were entitled to? He opened his mouth. But before he could answer, Pamela spoke, very quietly. Brandon. He turned toward her. She looked at him for several seconds. Then she said 4 words. I told you. And that was when I realized the story I thought I was telling my son was not the only story being told in that room. Pamela's words hung in the room. I told you. Brandon looked at her. What does that mean? Pamela didn't answer immediately. She looked down at the document, then back at her husband. I told you this wasn't sustainable. Brandon's face tightened. You never told me that. I did, she said. You just didn't want to hear it. I stayed quiet. This wasn't my conversation to interrupt. For years, I had assumed Brandon's problem was greed. Maybe it wasn't that simple. Maybe it was insecurity. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was a young man who had spent years trying to become the person he thought his father expected him to be. But none of that excused what he had done. Understanding someone doesn't mean removing the consequences of their choices. Leonard spoke first. Brandon, the purpose of this meeting isn't to punish you. It's to establish clear boundaries going forward. He placed another document on the table. This is the revised employment agreement. Brandon looked at it. Your position will be clearly defined. Your compensation will reflect your actual responsibilities. Your access to company resources will be limited to legitimate business purposes. He looked at me. And what about my future here? I answered. That depends on what you want. He frowned. What do you mean? You've been acting like the company belongs to you. I paused. But I've never told you that. Brandon looked down. I continued. You've been trying to become the heir to a business you never actually asked whether you wanted. He stared at me. Then something happened that I didn't expect. His shoulders dropped. The anger disappeared from his face. And he said, Dad. His voice sounded different. I don't actually want to run the company. Nobody spoke. I looked at him. What? He took a breath. I don't want it. I sat back. For years, he continued, I thought I was supposed to take over. Why? Because Mom built so much of it with you. He looked at the floor. And after she died, I thought, if I took over the company, I'd still be connected to her. His voice cracked slightly. But I don't love this business. He looked at me. I don't even know if I ever did. Pamela reached for his hand. Brandon continued. I thought if I wasn't the next owner, I'd be disappointing you. I felt something inside me shift. All those years, all those arguments about expansion, all those moments when I thought my son was becoming entitled to something he hadn't earned. Maybe some of them had been something else, a performance, a role, a life he thought he was supposed to want. I said, "You were never required to become me." He looked at me. "You're my son, not my replacement." He lowered his head. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that hurt more than the original argument. "I think I started believing that everything you gave me meant I owed you the company." I looked at him. And instead of admitting that I was scared, he said, I started acting like I owned it. There it was. The truth. Not an excuse, but the truth. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." He wiped his eyes. Then he looked at me. "I'm sorry about Sunday." I said nothing. I shouldn't have said that. "No," I said. "You shouldn't have." He nodded. "I was angry." "I know." "I thought you were spending money on things that didn't matter." I looked at him. "And now?" He glanced at the document. Now I realize I was talking about money that wasn't mine. That sentence mattered, because an apology isn't real until the person understands what they did wrong. I closed the folder. The $22,000 in personal expenses still needs to be repaid. He nodded. "I understand." "Not because I need the money," he looked at me, "because the principle matters." "I understand. And your position at Mercer Supply will change." "Okay. You're going to earn your future here if you decide you want one." He nodded. Then I asked him the question I should have asked years earlier. "What do you actually want?" He stared at me. "I don't know." And for the first time, I smiled. "That's okay." He looked confused. "It is?" "Yes." I stood up. "Not knowing what you want is a much better place to start than pretending you want something you don't." He smiled weakly. Then he stood. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Then Brandon walked around the table and hugged me. I held my son. Not the employee, not the heir, not the man who had spent $314,000 of my money. Just my son. The same boy I had once carried home from school when he had a fever. The same teenager who had fallen asleep in the back seat during long road trips. The same young man whose wedding I had paid for because he had looked at me and said it would mean everything. And suddenly, I understood something. I hadn't failed because I had given Brandon too much money. I had failed because I had never made him understand what the money was supposed to teach him. Responsibility. Gratitude. Independence. And eventually, the courage to build something of his own. 3 weeks later, George Patterson became Chief Operating Officer of Mercer Supply and Materials. The decision wasn't really about Brandon. It was about finally putting the right person in the right position. George had been doing the work for years. Now his title matched his responsibility. When I told him, he looked at me and said, "Are you sure?" I smiled. "George, I've never been more sure." He nodded. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "What about Brandon?" I said, "Brandon is figuring out who he is." George smiled. "Good. Why?" "Because maybe that's what he should have been doing all along." He was right. And then, 2 months later, Brandon called me. He sounded different, calmer, more confident. He told me he had an idea. He wanted to start a small consulting company in Atlanta, helping minority-owned businesses with financial planning and business strategy. He had seen how many small business owners struggled with problems he had learned to recognize through my company. I asked him one question. "How much money do you need?" There was silence. Then he said, "I'm not asking you for money." I smiled. That was the answer I had been waiting for. Not because I didn't want to help him, because I wanted to know whether he had finally decided to help himself. I said, "Good." He laughed. "You're not even going to offer?" "No." "Dad, you said you don't want my money." I said, "I'm not asking." "Then build it without it." He became quiet. Then he said, "Okay." I smiled. "Did that stop me in 1989? "No." Then it shouldn't stop you now. That was the last financial conversation we had for a long time. And that, more than the $314,000 document, was when I knew something had finally changed. Brandon wasn't looking at me as his bank account anymore. He was looking at me as his father, and I was finally learning how to be his father without trying to buy his future. 8 months after that Sunday dinner, Brandon and Pamela came to my house. They brought the grandchildren. The same table was waiting in the dining room. The same chairs, the same plates, even the same mashed potatoes my granddaughter had been eating the night Brandon told me to stop wasting his money. But something was different. The room felt lighter. There was no tension, no performance, no careful calculation about who was paying for what. Just a family having dinner. My grandson, now 11, watched his father and me for a while. Then he asked, "Grandpa, are you and Dad okay now?" I looked at Brandon. He smiled. "We're more than okay." My grandson nodded, then went back to his food. After dinner, something happened that I will remember for the rest of my life. Brandon stood up. He collected the plates and walked into the kitchen. I followed him. He turned on the water and started doing the dishes. I leaned against the doorway. He looked over his shoulder. "What?" "Nothing." "You're staring at me." "I am." He laughed. "Why?" I smiled. "Your grandmother would have loved this." He understood immediately. Vivian had always believed that character revealed itself in ordinary moments, not in expensive dinners, not in business meetings, not in speeches, in small things. Keeping your word, showing up on time, paying what you owe, doing what needs to be done even when nobody is watching. Brandon rinsed a plate. Then he said, "You know, Dad." "What?" "I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me." I looked at him. "What?" "That money isn't the point." I smiled. "No." He dried the plate. "The point is what you do with what you're given." I nodded. "And what you build after it." "Exactly." He put the plate away. Then he looked at me. "I'm sorry I ever called it my money." I said, "I know." He smiled and went back to the dishes. I stood there watching my son, and I thought about the $314,000. The college tuition, the wedding, the house, the salary, the business expenses. For years, I had believed those things were what I had given my son. But I was wrong. Money was simply what I had handed him. The real gift was supposed to be the example behind it. My father taught me that by driving a delivery truck for 28 years. My mother taught me through every sacrifice she made without complaining. Vivian taught me through 29 years of careful accounting, and one final warning I should have taken more seriously. And eventually, Brandon had to learn the same lesson for himself. You can give someone money, you can give them opportunities, you can open doors, but you cannot walk through those doors for them. At some point, they have to build something with their own hands. And sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is stop making the road easy. Not because you want your child to struggle, because you want them to become strong enough to walk without you. That Sunday changed my relationship with my son. But not because I emptied his bank accounts. I never did. I simply emptied an illusion. The illusion that love meant unlimited access. The illusion that generosity meant entitlement. And the illusion that being my son automatically made everything I owned his. It didn't. What was mine was mine. What was his was his. And what we shared was something more valuable than either. Trust, respect, and the freedom to choose our own lives. Brandon eventually built his consulting business. It took time. He struggled. He made mistakes. He learned. And I watched from a distance. I didn't write the checks. I didn't rescue him when things became difficult. But when he called and said, "Dad, I think I finally have something," I listened. And when he needed advice, I gave it. Not money. Advice. There is a difference, and I think that difference saved our relationship. Because the goal of parenting isn't to make your children dependent on you forever. It's to prepare them to stand without you. I spent years giving Brandon what I could. On that Sunday, I finally learned what I should have been giving him all along. An example, a boundary, and the confidence to build something of his own. Money runs out, opportunities change, businesses fail, houses get sold. But the model you give your children can stay with them for the rest of their lives. So if you're a parent listening to me right now, remember this. You don't have to give your children everything to prove that you love them. Sometimes love is a yes, sometimes love is a no, and sometimes the hardest thing a father can say is, That's not yours. Not because you want to take something away, because you want your child to learn how to earn something for himself. And if this story reminded you of someone in your own life, tell me in the comments. Have you ever given too much to someone you loved, only to realize they needed something completely different from you? I genuinely like to hear your story, and if you're watching from somewhere around the world, tell me your city, state, or country too. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell stories about money. We tell stories about family, choices, consequences, forgiveness, and the lessons that stay with us long after the dinner table is empty. And remember, money runs out. The example you leave behind doesn't. I'll see you in the next story.